Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us here on this, our second week of Lent. And we're here this morning looking towards Easter. And we're in this season where, as the church, we turn our eyes towards the cross, towards Jesus' sacrifice, knowing that his resurrection is on the other side of that. But we're also in this season as people in the world during a pandemic, where we've come through so much in the last 11 and a half months. And it's been difficult at times, and many of us have been trying to figure out how to navigate this. Our plans changed, our lives changed, and we're not the same group that existed a year ago. Now, some have joined our numbers while others are no longer here, and we miss them dearly. In all of this upheaval, it's difficult to balance the reality of what we're facing with the hope of a better day on the other side of this. It can be easy to put all our eggs in one of those baskets. We can focus entirely on the end of COVID, even when we don't really know when that's going to happen or how it's going to look. Or we can put our heads down and say that this is just how it is now, and we better get used to it because it's never going to change. But as with Easter, there's a balance. There is hope in tomorrow. There is hope on the other side of this. And the day when our hope is realized will be wonderful, and there will be tears of joy, and there will be celebration. But there's also the reality of the struggle. Jesus really did die. And COVID really is hard. So as a church, as a group of believers, as a family, how do we exist in this space? How do we mourn what we've lost and make space for the hope? And last week we talked about the difficulty of balancing that and the example that we see in the book of John when Lazarus is raised from the dead. We saw how his sisters, Mary and Martha, were comforted and supported. We saw how they responded to the situation in their grief. And we saw their hope fighting to stay alive. And then we saw their hope realized in their brother's resurrection. We talked about the stage of grief, sometimes described as shock, and where we saw it in their story. And today we're jumping forward in time. And the next stage of grief that we're looking at is denial. And the place where we see that happening most clearly on the road to the cross is quite a bit later. It's quite a bit after the Lazarus story. And it's not a reaction to the death of a loved one, but more the death of an idea. Now, these moments, they're harder to identify, and it's usually in hindsight when we recognize these moments in our own lives. And part of what makes it so hard is that when we're in that stage of denial, we don't accept the reality of what we're being presented with. Now, I can make broad generalizations about times where people have done that, but I don't think it's fair to point it out in other people's lives, especially when you're not speaking to them. It's a part of the grieving process, and those who are in this situation, those who are experiencing denial, they've also just experienced a loss. And ignoring that or minimizing that, it's not a way of supporting them. It's not a way of journeying with them while they grieve. And in my own life, I try not to slip into denial, at least not for any meaningful time. But it happens, and it probably happens more than I'd like. It probably happens more than I realize. But the most common occurrence, I think, is when I'm watching sports. And if things go horribly, drastically wrong, and the team that I'm cheering for isn't just losing, but is about to be embarrassed, I tell myself something. I tell myself that I wasn't really invested in the game anyways. I didn't really care about the outcome, so it's fine. It's fine for me to switch over and do something else. I don't actually care if the Toronto Maple Leafs win. They can't win every game. So I get out from under my Toronto Maple Leafs blanket and walk out of the room wearing my Toronto Maple Leafs socks, and I hang up my Toronto Maple Leafs sweater in the closet until the next game. Like I said, clearly I'm not invested. I don't need to watch the end of the game. They can't win them all. That line's one of the greatest paradoxes in sports. You can't win them all. Except that if you didn't believe that it was possible, why would you cheer? Why would you buy tickets? Why would you get excited? Even if, logically, you know that winning every game is statistically improbable. Every time a game starts and you sit there beside your radio, in front of your TV, or in the olden days when such things still happened, you might be sitting there in the stands. You expect that this is one of those games that your team will win. Now, I know that I'm not alone in this, because when there are people watching the game live, if the home team is losing, you can actually see the people in the stands starting to filter out, starting to leave early. Now, this is a harmless example. The stakes are fairly low. But sometimes this denial catches us off guard and shows up in moments of greater significance that leave us feeling exposed, vulnerable, broken. And today we're going to be reading about Peter experiencing and reacting to his own denial. And it can be found in all 4 gospel accounts, but today we're going to be reading from the gospel according to Luke. Now, from here on out, we'll be following the stages of grief in order, but we won't necessarily be following the Easter story chronologically. And our first example of that is that we're looking at the account of what has happened after Jesus has been taken away by armed guards. He's on trial at night, and it seems like part of the process of this hastily convened trial is deciding on what Jesus is actually going to be charged with. Now, while this is taking place, we have a record of what happened to Peter, one of Jesus' disciples, one of his followers. And we're going to be reading from the Gospel according to Luke in chapter 22, starting in verse 54. They grabbed him at this point and took him away to the high priest's home. Peter followed at a distance. He watched from the shadows as those who had seized Jesus made a fire in the center of the courtyard and sat down around it. Then Peter slipped in quietly and sat with them. But a young servant girl saw his face in the firelight, and she stared for a while and then spoke. "This fellow here was with Jesus. I recognize him." "Woman, I don't even know the man." A little while later, a man also recognized him. "I recognize you. You're one of Jesus' followers." "Man, you're wrong. I'm not." An hour or so passed, and then another person pointed to Peter. "This fellow is obviously Galilean. He must be a member of Jesus' group. Look, I have no idea what you're talking about." And he hadn't even finished the sentence when a nearby rooster crowed. And the Lord turned toward Peter, and their eyes met. Peter remembered Jesus' words about his triple denial before the rooster would crow. So he left the courtyard and wept bitter tears. So Jesus has been arrested, and everyone who is with him has scattered throughout Jerusalem. And the gospel according to John, John writes that the two of them, John and Peter, followed along behind Jesus. But here in Luke, we only read about Peter. Those who took Jesus into custody have handed him off to the high priest. His trial is underway, and so they gather together in the courtyard and they light a fire. Now, to this point, Peter's been sticking to the shadows. But as the fire sparks, catches, and grows, Peter moves out of the shadow towards the center. And most gospel writers don't give him a motivation, and maybe he wanted to insert himself, to listen for any clues about what might be happening with Jesus, to get a better sense of what's taking place. Again, John writes a slightly different account, giving him a motivation that simply says that he was trying to get warm. But over the course of the night, people begin to recognize Peter. And the way Luke writes it, you can feel him getting increasingly agitated. The more he's asked, the more upset he seems to be. No, you must be mistaken. You don't know me. No, I wasn't with Jesus. I'm not even from Galilee. I don't know what you're talking about. The way Luke writes it, Peter gets more and more exasperated. But the way the other gospel writers tell it, he wasn't just more emotional. As he was pressed, he swore oaths. He swore. He didn't just deny Jesus. It was as if he jumped up on the stand, put one hand over his heart and the other over the scriptures, and stated unequivocally that he was not now, would not be in the future, and never was connected to the man named Jesus. I don't even know the man. You're wrong. I'm not one of his followers. Look, I have no idea what you're talking about. But before he can even finish that sentence, Peter hears the rooster crow. And he's transported back to a moment that we read about earlier in this chapter, in Luke 22:34. As they sat together in the infamous upper room in Jerusalem that Da Vinci immortalized in his painting, The Last Supper, Jesus looked Peter in the eye and spoke these words. I tell you, Peter, the rooster shall not crow this day before you will deny 3 times that you know me. And as Peter hears the rooster, he's taken back to that moment. He remembers those words. He remembers the way Jesus looked at him. He remembered his own words right before that when he said, Lord, I am ready to go with you, both to prison and to death. But here he finds himself by the fire, doing the very thing that he said earlier that night that he would not do. The way Luke writes it, he left the courtyard and wept bitter tears. This is the moment we've read about. Peter denies Jesus. And we talk about it as a moment of betrayal, a moment of weakness. We finish this account with a taste as bitter as the tears that Peter wept. This is not a moment he is proud of. And for those of us who recognize ourselves in this story, it can be painful to see ourselves in this account. And while we recognize that Peter did not live up to our standards, he didn't even live up to his own standards. We should also be able to recognize that Peter is in the midst of an evening where nothing has gone according to plan. As the night has gone on, things have gotten progressively worse, and it's beginning to seem like they're only going to get worse from here. He's passed through shock, and he's at the stage in his grief where he is experiencing denial. What is he grieving, though? Jesus hasn't even been sentenced, and we don't even know what his charges are yet. But we can draw some conclusions about what Peter is mourning based on his denial. The two are linked. The inciting incident was Jesus being taken away and brought before the high priest. Now, Peter isn't denying that this has happened. The arrest on its own, that's not what he's mourning. If it was, his denial would more likely take on the shape of refusing to believe that Jesus had actually been arrested. He wasn't arrested. They've just brought him in to ask for his advice. No, he wasn't arrested. This is all part of his plan. The soldiers are in on it. But that's not the shape of his denial. His denial is, I don't know Jesus. His mourning is tied to the very idea of being associated with Jesus. Why is he doing this? What about his relationship with Jesus is lost? What is he mourning? Something's gone. Earlier this evening, Peter said he would give his life both literally and figuratively for this man. And now in this courtyard, that no longer appears to be the case. Peter denies Jesus because he is mourning the loss of knowing what was going to happen next. Because he was so sure Jesus was the Messiah. He was going to liberate them. He was going to sweep through the land and change everything. And after he was done, the occupying Roman force was going to be a distant memory. Jesus had the power to do that. Jesus had the authority to do that. Peter would give his life for that. He would go to jail. He would die. He would give anything and everything for Jesus. But then the soldiers came. If there was a moment to rise up, this was it. But no, Peter was chastised for his actions. And Jesus was carried off. And Peter's hope died. His hope for a better day, his hope for freedom from oppression had died. So he denied Jesus, the man in whom he had put that hope, the person who had come to represent his hope. I don't know him. Who's that? I wouldn't give my life for him. I wouldn't follow him. He's not the guy who's going to overthrow Rome. He's not the one who's going to save us. Him? Never heard of him. Not me. We know what happens on the next page. We know the next chapter of this story. We know how wrong Peter is in feeling that way. But he just can't see it because he's lost in the middle of things and he doesn't know which way is up, and so he's fighting for control. He rejects these ideas that he once held on to because if it's not leading to the outcome he imagined, then he needs to recalibrate. He needs to figure out why these last months even happened. That's one of the struggles that we're facing right now. Things are changing. The way that we thought 2020 would play out ended up being entirely wrong. And already 2021 has had some unexpected turns. And maybe we thought that things would be wrapped up by the summer or before Christmas. But here we are on the last day of February, and things still haven't changed. So what is it that we're telling ourselves as we struggle to regain control? What is it that we're denying? Now, I don't want to get bogged down in this space. I don't want to move you beyond denial and deposit you in anger or depression or one of the other stages of grief. All these stages, they're common reactions to traumatic events in our lives. And they aren't inherently wrong. They're a part of reality. But the question of this sermon series is, how do we do this together? How do we support one another? How do we love one another? As family, how do we mourn together? And as we look to the scriptures and see that the things that we're experiencing, others have experienced as well, how do we walk alongside each other through these times? Now, in this account, it seems as though Peter is alone. But going back to verse 34, we can see that's not the case. Jesus was with him. And Jesus saw where things were headed. And even though Peter wasn't in a place to be able to hear the truth of Jesus' words, Jesus let Peter know what was going to happen. And in the moment where Peter was experiencing it, the way that Luke records it, Jesus looks right at Peter. And there, in this moment of connection, Peter, lost, acting out, feeling alone, sees that Jesus is still there with him. And even as Peter feels the weight of what he's just done, something else happens. As the rooster crows, as Peter recognizes the mistake he has made, as he recognizes that Jesus was right and that Peter was going to and did do this thing that he said he would never do, that he couldn't imagine doing. At the end of this moment where Peter has distanced himself more and more from hope, he's reminded that Jesus was right. He's reminded that Jesus said this would happen, and it did with precision. He's reminded that Jesus has authority. He is reminded that Jesus is in control. And as he weeps bitterly, as he flees into the night, having denied Jesus, Jesus has shown Peter that his hope is still alive. And when the rooster crowed, it was a reminder for Peter that he made a mistake. But it also reminded him that Jesus is who he says he is. And when we are caught in that place, when we are denying the severity of the situation or the reality of what has taken place, it can be hard to see the hope. We're struggling to see what's right in front of us, but it is there. And in those moments where we feel alone, where we feel isolated, Jesus is with us. In those moments where we've screwed up, Jesus is reminding us that he still loves us. Even as he calls us to be better, to pursue holiness, he reminds us that he loves us and he has not given up on us. And walking through this time of mourning can feel heavy. It can feel overwhelming in so many ways. We're in uncharted waters. As family, we are in this together. We are not the hope on the other side. We are in this together. And we can't make things better or fix things. We do not have that resurrection power. But one thing we can do is point the way. We can point towards Jesus. We can point towards his faithfulness, towards his loving kindness. and we can point towards the hope that he brings. We can be there alongside our family members as they go through these phases. We can stand by as the members of our family deny what we can see plainly. We can let them know that we are there for them. We can show them that we are there with them, and we can point them towards the hope that we may have thought died, but conquered death, rose again, and sits at the right hand of the Father in heaven. We're going to sing now a song that takes us to those dark moments of doubt, where things are unfamiliar, where we are in uncharted waters. It's a song called Oceans, and it reminds us that in the depths of our despair, in those moments of loss, when we feel as though we are being overwhelmed, that we can still find comfort in Jesus' embrace, that we can still find him there with us in those unknown places. And as the song plays, I just want to invite you to think through the last year and think through some of the conversations that you've had. Think through some of the things that you've seen and heard as people have tried to respond to the different experiences that they've had of loss. How can you point those people towards hope? How can you help them to see that in their struggle, they are not alone? Where feet may fall, where fear surrounds, how can you help them to see that God has never failed us and won't start now? Let's sing together.